Hello, class, and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a literary study of the quintessential quintuplets. So, a bit about today's video. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the first volume of the Quintessential Quintuplets, and the purpose of this video is to essentially treat this manga the same way you would treat any of the literary classics you would study in high school and college, English classes. So basically what that means is that we're going to take a look at the plot of each chapter, do a little character analysis, and then discuss things like theme. And also, here's like the little plug to make sure you subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet, since, we're going to be taking a look at the rest of the series. I think we're going to sort of mix it up and alternate videos, but if you don't want to miss the rest of this, make sure you subscribe. And then I wanted to give a little spoiler warning for Volume 1 of the Quintessential Quintuplets. Everything after this will be in spoiler territory, but I am going to do my best just to focus on Volume 1, so I don't think there'll really be spoilers for the rest of the volumes in this episode. So, Chapter 1, which is called The Quintessential Quintuplets. Chapter 1. So in Chapter 1, it begins with an introduction of Futaro. We learn right away that he is poor, cheap, a loner, and an academic scholar. We also learn that he is pretty antisocial based on his interactions with Itsuki. So he meets Itsuki when they both try to sit at the same table. He discovers that she appears to be rich based on all the food she has from the cafeteria. And she discovers that he scores really high on his tests, and as a result, asks him to tutor her. However, Futaro responds coldly to this and basically high-key calls her fat for all of the food she's eating. After he leaves the table, he gets a call from his little sister, Raya, and she tells him that their dad found Futaro a part-time job tutoring a rich girl. Futaro soon realizes that this rich girl is none other than Itsuki. So, the next day, Futaro decides that he needs to get on Itsuki's good side because he can't afford to basically miss out on this part-time job. So, he approaches her at lunch but finds her sitting with a group of friends. These friends include Ichika and Yotsuba. Ichika has a slightly more mature, outgoing nature than Itsuki, and she teases Futaro and seems bemused at his situation. Yotsuba, however, seems more interested in Futaro. She follows him around and immediately is very conversational with him. After class, Futaro tries to approach Itsuki and finds her with Miku and Nino. Nino seems more like an average, kind of popular high schooler, while Miku seems to be more of a sort of quiet loner and has sort of like that kind of vibe. So, Futaro ultimately basically chases after Itsuki and attempts to apologize, but his pride gets the better of him. He manages to tell Itsuki that he's her tutor and kind of try to, clear up the air, but as she sort of pauses in disbelief at realizing that Futaro is the one who's going to be her tutor, it's revealed that Futaro isn't just Itsuki's tutor. He's actually the tutor of Miku, Nino, Yotsuba, and Ichika. And this is because they aren't just friends, they're actually quintuplets. So after this reveal, we flash forward in time, and it's now the day of Futaro's wedding, and it's revealed that he's marrying one of the quintuplets, and basically everything we're seeing is actually a flashback. However, we don't know which one of the quintuplets he's marrying, and this ultimately becomes one of the biggest mysteries of the entire series. And that concludes Chapter 1. And that brings us to Chapter 2, Home Visit. So, in Chapter 2, it begins with Futaro calling the quintuplets' dad to make sure that this isn't some sort of prank. Afterwards, though, Yotsuba gives him a tour of their apartment. She's the first girl to agree to letting him tutor them. During Yotsuba's tour, we learn that Yotsuba got the lowest score on their test. Itsuki takes her studies the most seriously. Miku is the smartest of the quintuplets. Nino is a social butterfly, and Ichika is, well, Ichika. Also, her room is very messy. So, basically, there's a hint of some mystery regarding what happened to the girls last school and why they've transferred. But before this can be revealed, Nino announces that she's baked cookies and wants everyone to have some. Everyone sits down to eat the baked goods and eventually study. However, it's soon revealed that Nino actually drugged Futuro's drink, and so he wakes up in the back of a taxi and is driven home. Itsuki, however, has actually come with to make sure that Futuro gets home safe. She also pays for his expensive taxi fare. And, as he's getting out, Futuro's sister invites Itsuki inside to share a meal with Futuro's family. And Itsuki accepts this invitation, and through sharing this meal, learns more about Futuro's situation and, his poverty and all of that. So, in order to help his sister, Itsuki agrees to basically tell her dad that Futuro is tutoring her. However, she vows that she will still do all of her actual studying alone. So, Futuro has a revelation about his tutoring situation after this conversation with Itsuki and meets with all of the girls. He reveals that he has a new strategy. If the girls can pass a test, he won't need to tutor them since they can graduate independently. And therefore, instead of tutoring all of the girls, he would be able to focus his attention on just the prospective flunkers. So, this plan, however, falls apart since all of the girls fail his sort of practice test. And this is when it's fully revealed that all of the sisters had to leave their last school since they were all about to flunk out. And that brings us to Chapter 3, Rooftop Confession. So, Chapter 3 starts with Futuro meeting the girls outside of the school. The girls reaffirm that they can study alone, so Futuro asks them the following question. Who was the general that Motonari Mori defeated at the Battle of Itsukushima? Rather than answering, the girls all run away. Later, Futuro approaches Miku. She tries to bring up the question from this morning, but Yotsuba interrupts to ask Futuro to eat lunch together. Futuro ignores Yotsuba, and Ichika tries to pull away Yotsuba so as to not bother Futuro and Miku. Before leaving, however, Ichika brings up the idea of basically not wasting all of high school on studying and basically the importance of having fun with things like high school romance. Futuro responds by saying that love is basically utterly foolish and far removed from academics. And remember, we know that he is eventually going to get married to one of the sisters, so part of our analysis is studying his perception of love. So, Yotsuba and Ichika tease Miku about having a crush, and later Futuro finds a note from Miku asking him to come to the rooftop during lunch. He suspects that this will be a love confession since this is sort of a trope of the genre. It's notable that the idea of this really flusters him, and Itsuki actually calls him out on grinning weirdly while reading the note. Ultimately, however, he tries to be nonchalant about this and act like he knows it's all just a prank, but he clearly doesn't want it to be a prank. So Miku meets Futuro on the roof. However, rather than confessing her love for him, she actually confesses that she knew the answer to his question that morning, and that furthermore, she likes Sengoku period warlords. So Futaro tries to use his knowledge of warlords to entice Miku into studying. This backfires, however, since she sees this more as a challenge regarding who knows more about the warlords than, actually a motivation for studying. And that brings us to Chapter 4, 100 Points Combined. So, after having, basically had disappointed Miku with his knowledge of historic warlords, basically he misses a reference she makes while handing him a drink, Futaro studies extra hard on this subject and challenges Miku to a duel to see who knows more about the Sengoku period of history. This ends up becoming a very dramatic chase around the school involving disguises and games of wit. Ultimately, however, they both become exhausted and basically give up. Futaro reveals that Yotsuba and him had been hanging out in the library and that she had showed him the internet, which let him look up the more niche facts about the Sengoku period. Through their conversation, Miku reveals that it's not really that she lacks confidence in studying, but instead that she lacks confidence in herself. This conversation gives Futaro a revelation. He reveals that each of the quintuplets has their own strengths, so if they work together and support each other based on their strengths, then they can all improve enough to graduate. Later, while Futaro and Yotsuba are studying together on an off day, Miku decides to join them. As a result, Yotsuba begins to suspect that Miku might have a crush on Futaro. And that brings us to Chapter 5, The Problems Keep Piling Up. So, in Chapter 5, it begins with Futaro heading over to the quintuplets' apartment for another study session. All of the sisters seem ready and willing to study. All of them except for Nino. That is, one by one, Nino convinces / reminds / tricks her sisters into leaving the study session. Miku is the only one who stays. Nino then challenges Miku to a cook-off, and the rules are simple. Whoever makes a better dish wins, and if Nino wins, there will be no study session. Nino is clearly the better chef, but Futaro seems to genuinely enjoy both meals, thus causing a stalemate. This challenge itself, however, was actually a trick since basically it took so long to cook the meals that it was now too late to study. So Futaro leaves to go home, but then realizes that he forgot his wallet, so he returns to the apartment and accidentally walks in on Nino after she's bathed, thus resulting in Itsuki catching him and calling him a creep. As this happens, we see a montage of further complications. Ichika has some sort of mystery job, Yotsuba is going to join the basketball team and therefore have less time to study, and Miku is starting to develop feelings for Futaro. So that pretty much wraps up the actual plot of the first volume. So now I want to just jump into some general discussion. So, the themes and the main ideas of this first volume. The first big one is pride comes before the fall. So, most of the problems that arise in this come from Futaro's pride. He's unable to apologize to Itsuki, he assumes he knows more than everyone, and he often misreads situations as a result of his pride. However, the pride of the girls also causes a lot of complications. They don't want a fellow student to tutor them, they insist that they can study on their own, despite not being able to, and then they have a hard time admitting to Futaro that they need help. In a way, Itsuki and Futaro's dynamic sort of reminds me of Elizabeth and Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. I don't want to totally spoil Pride and Prejudice, but if you know that reference, you'll get what I'm saying. The importance of learning about the girls individually and seeing them both independently and in the context of quintuplets is the other major theme. So it seems like the solution to Futaro's sort of situation is to ultimately learn more about each girl and learn how they operate individually and as sisters. So he has to understand basically how they click together as quintuplets, but also who they are individually outside of that relationship of being quintuplets. And then I want to discuss which girl is it. So, as mentioned earlier, one of the big sort of mysteries is who he's going to get married to. So, as we read through these volumes, I want to take a look at different clues and hints and indications to see who it might be. So, Itsuki. This is the first girl he meets, so she technically gets the meet cute plot point. So basically, if you don't know that, there's a plot point in romance novels where the hero and heroine first meet. It's usually a memorable moment filled with some level of hijinks, and then the next plot point is them doing the no way. They meet together and it's, oh, no way, I could never meet him. And then the next part is them slowly getting closer and closer. So here they had that where they both meet at that lunch table. They accidentally sort of insult each other, but especially Futaro insults Itsuki. Then they realize which is sort of the pinch point, is that they have to hang out together because he has to tutor them. So presumably we might watch them getting closer and closer. Itsuki also is the first to meet Futaro's family, and she's immediately accepted into their house, which wins her a lot of points. As mentioned earlier, they sort of have a Pride and Prejudice dynamic where they're going to fight but could, eventually also fall in love. And so therefore, purely in terms of narrative structure, Itsuki is, a very strong candidate. Then we have Yotsuba. Yotsuba is technically the first to agree to studying with Futaro. She also seems to cling to him a lot and is often asking him to hang out, etc. There's also some subtle mentions of them hanging out off camera, like when she shows Futaro how to look up warlord history on the internet. And she seems oddly familiar with Futaro, but this could also just be her outgoing nature. As a point against her, it's weird that she's, abandons him at the end to go play basketball while Miku stays, especially since, this seems very important to Futaro. Futaro also seems kind of annoyed whenever Yotsuba shows up. She usually barges in on a conversation and tries to steer it in a different direction, and Futaro usually basically ignores this. And she also gets the lowest test scores, and since we know he's sort of an academics nerd, that could be a point against her. Then we have Miku. So Miku appears to be the first girl to develop feelings for Futaro, as we see at the end of Volume 1. She's also the first to really agree to study with Futaro. Yotsuba seems to mostly just kind of hang out with Futaro, but Miku is the first to stay with Futaro when Nino tries to ruin things and wants to actually study. Miku is also the smartest and possibly the most studious, though Itsuki is the one who seems to try the most at studying. And it seems like Futaro values the characteristics of studying and being smart, so he might value that in her. Also, Futaro seemed genuinely excited at the prospect of her confessing her feelings on the rooftop, so he seems to be somewhat attracted to her. And when they have to head back to class while they're on the roof, he seems genuinely disappointed that their conversation has to wrap up and even says, but I wish that we could have talked longer. And this is the first time he hasn't seemed totally annoyed by the quintuplets, and I feel like this sort of chemistry between Futaro and Miku sort of makes Miku a strong contender. And then we have Ichika and Nino, so we don't really know too much about them. Ichika has some sort of mystery around her, which might be like a secret lover or something, while Nino seems to genuinely hate Futaro, unlike Itsuki where it seems to be more of like a sort of pride thing. So we'll have to read more to find out what's really going on with them. So, my final thoughts. So far, I'm really enjoying this manga series. The general premise of having to tutor quintuplets is really fun, and I like how all of the sisters feel really unique, but occasionally they'll have the same facial expression or mannerism. And I also really like the humor in that they all hate school, but are also all fairly witty and conniving outside of school. And there's a fun level of escapism with their whole apartment situation. I just think it's kind of fun to imagine from the girl's perspective getting to live with 4 of your sisters in a super fancy apartment where you all have your own unique rooms, etc. And I also feel like it would be really fun to be friends with such a chaotic group of sisters. In that way, it also sort of reminds me of Pride and Prejudice, how, Elizabeth has all of these sisters and they all have, sort of crazy personalities, but, it seems fun to sort of be part of that family. So, furthermore, I also really enjoy how the series has basically incorporated a huge mystery into what would otherwise be a pretty standard slice of life romance. With this sort of genre, you're always going to wonder which character the hero will end up with. But with this one, there's the extra mystery since you can actually see the bride, but you can't tell which one she is since they're all identical. So it makes you constantly look for clues in the dialogue and just sort of like little references and stuff. But with that being said, I think I'm gonna, wrap up this first episode on the Quintessential Quintuplets. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the series in the comments below. But I do ask that you don't spoil anything, since we're sort of trying to treat this as a series where we'll learn more as we go. So, without spoilers, who do you think Futaro will end up with? What do you think is sort of Ichika's secret? And why do you think Nino is so against Futaro? Also, do you agree with my theories around Itsuki being sort of maybe the main girl based purely on the role she's playing within like the meta of the narrative? Let me know in the comments. I really enjoy our discussions. It's one of my favorite parts of posting, so I'd love to hear from all of you. But with that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up, so take care, and I will see you in the next one.